Hello, everyone, and welcome back to English 2367. This is K-Swizzle checking in with your Week 7 overview lecture. Just from the top, I want to say I hope that you are doing well. I hope that your loved ones and pets and just anyone, obviously also you, anyone who could possibly have been affected by the just power outage and extreme heat waves in the past week in Columbus. I hope that you are doing okay. And that if you lost power, if you just experienced any difficulties, from the just temperatures and power outage problems that were happening, I just hope that you're doing all right. If you are experiencing persistent issues related to power or just things are really difficult for you right now, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I would be more than happy to talk about ways that we can make sure that you can finish strong in this class without being too burdened down by the things that need to get done. So without further ado, let's talk about this week's agenda. So on the agenda, we have 3 sections. We'll talk first about this week's theme, which is drafting the final project, preparing a rough draft. Following that, we will talk about this week's to-do list or the tasks that you'll want to complete before watching the next lecture. And finally, we will cover assignment snapshots or an overview of week 7 assignments, which consist of the rough draft of literature review, final draft of literature review, and rough draft of research project. So let's start with this week's theme. So as I mentioned, this week's theme is drafting the final project, preparing a rough draft. And it's a pretty straightforward week in the sense that all that we have left for this course really is focused on making sure that you can finish this semester research project that you began with the research proposal, that you're continuing with for the literature review, and that you're finishing strong with in terms of completing and submitting that final project. So as I mentioned, of course, and as we've talked about already, the semester research project is comprised of the research proposal of 1 to 2 pages, which is 5% of your final grade, the literature review of 5 to 6 pages, which is 15% of your final grade, and the final project, which is 8 to 10 pages or alternate format, and it is comprising 30% of your final grade. And once again, all of these assignments are scaffolded to help you be able to complete this final project with as much preparation and time to think about your research topic and argumentative intervention as possible. As you will see in my focus lecture for this week, my focus is really going to be about talking more about developing from having a research topic to having a specific argumentative intervention. Reason being that now that you have completed the research proposal and as you're presently working on the literature review this week, I really want to give us the opportunity to talk through what are some ways that we can recognize compelling aspects of argumentation. How can we ensure that you can really recognize the difference between summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting? And more specifically, how can we begin thinking about the ways that you'll want to integrate the ideas presented in your research proposal into your final project rough draft, along with incorporating secondary source connections that you begin thinking through with the literature review. So as we've already covered, you have already submitted the research proposal by the time that you're watching this lecture, and the research proposal stages consisted of the rough draft, the peer feedback on research proposals, and the final draft. And of course, given that last week was really chaotic for anyone in Ohio who was experiencing power outages, it felt like it made the most sense for me to extend the timeline for you to submit that final draft of the research proposal until the Sunday of week 7. And so obviously there were some kind of changes in terms of the timeline in which I was able to provide you with feedback, and even just like the timeline in which you were potentially able to get the assignment done. But my hope is that the research proposal feedback that you receive from me and your peers can really continue to be of helpful, help, I should say, as you begin working on this literature review and as you move into thinking about this final project, right? And just as a reminder, the literature review consists of 3 stages: a rough draft, feedback that you receive from me, and a final draft. So you don't provide any kind of peer feedback on this literature review. Instead, just like you had with the research proposal, you'll receive feedback from me that's pretty in-depth and is really where I'm going to kind of concentrate on pushing you to refine your argumentative intervention. You'll notice that my feedback for the research proposal was largely concentrated on recommendations based on, what primary sources are you thinking of working with? What secondary source connections can you possibly make by way of the literature review, and really making a lot of recommendations to advance you from the research proposal stage to the literature review stage. My goal with the feedback that I provide for you with the literature review is that I can help you move from the literature review stage to the final project stage by giving you some suggestions about kind of noticing how your argument has developed from the research proposal to the literature review, and more specifically, really guiding you in the direction of thinking about how does the final project that you will be creating between this week and next week allow for the opportunity to really utilize the affordances of your selected form or medium to create a compelling argument in which the content that you're presenting to your audience feels satisfactory enough that a reader or viewer of it would be, inclined to accept and agree with the analytical focus and argumentative intervention that you are making. So you'll definitely see then that, with the research proposal, my feedback was really concentrated on the kind of what materials are you thinking of working with? And here's some secondary sources you might want to start looking into to build out the scope of the context section in your final project. With the literature review feedback, you're going to find that I'm going to mostly be focused on argumentation, and especially I'm going to be providing feedback in regards to, are you really able to perform a kind of analysis of these secondary sources where you can recognize the difference between, their argumentative intervention and your own argumentative intervention, and really can you already start to tease out where potentially these literature, citations will be of use to your final project. And of course, with the final project, you have a rough draft, peer feedback on semester research project, and a final draft. And so this will work pretty much exactly like the research proposal process in the sense that you'll submit a rough draft at the end of this week, which I'll talk more about later in this lecture. You'll receive peer feedback on that draft by next week so that you can consult that along with my feedback going into the final. And then of course you have a final draft that you will turn in, and that will really conclude our course. And my goal this week is to kind of get through the remaining assignments that I owe you so that you can also look at my feedback in terms of endnotes in regards to the response paper 2 and my kind of marginal comments on your highlight reels as a way for me to really give you some additional insight and feedback into thinking about argumentation and thinking about kind of primary source close readings and analysis that you might also want to carry with you into the final. So let's go ahead and talk about this week's to-do list or tasks that you'll want to complete before watching the next lecture. So as always, you have a breakdown of what this week's tasks look like in the schedule of assignments document that is posted to Carmen under course materials. It's a pretty straightforward week, as I mentioned. However, you'll notice that the kind of timelines of when you're turning things in will have adjusted or kind of changed on Carmen compared to what's listed here, because of course I modified these things based on everyone's experiences, or at least a good majority of the class's experiences last week. Now, in terms of this week's reading, you do have another excerpt from Who Says, and that's chapter 8, pages 107 to 123, which I will talk through in my focus lecture for this week. As always, I ask that you're really making sure that you are pausing to read the excerpts from each chapter that I'm asking you to read, because I am moving with the expectation that when it comes to the final project, you are implementing the different writing strategies from these textbooks into the writing that you're submitting for this course. I do my best to try to, utilize some of these strategies as well in my focus lectures, but it's not possible for me to really cover all of these things without creating a 6-hour lecture for each week, right? So it's going to be important that you really treat the Who Says and So What textbooks continually as a supplemental guide that's meant to kind of add to your understanding of argumentation techniques and add to your understanding of how you can perform the most robust analytical work on your primary sources. So let's talk about the assignment deadline changes for week 6 and 7. Now, you'll already have received this information on Carmen Messenger because I sent it out already, but I want to reiterate it in case it gets confusing, but also because one of the things I don't like about Carmen Messenger is that I can't bold text or use colorful fonts, which is much more natural for me to kind of communicate a point. And so for me, it felt that it was going to be the most succinct way for me to kind of explain and discuss these deadline changes by offering you a slide that visualizes what these changes consist of. So assuming that you'll have already turned in the final draft of the research proposal by the time that you watch these lectures, you have 3 assignments that are due in week 7, and they consist of the rough draft of literature review, the final draft of literature review, and the rough draft of final project. Reason being, in week 8, you'll be turning in the peer feedback on the final project and the final draft of the final project. And so we really don't have too much time left to kind of work through these things. But also, as I've mentioned, of course, the second part of the semester for us really is concentrated on completing this final project over time and giving you these kind of full 4 weeks to get the work done that you need for this final. So the first assignment for this week, like I said, is the rough draft of literature review. And originally, this assignment was going to be due between Saturday, June 18th and Monday, June 20th. As a reminder, this is based on kind of the Saturday deadline extended timeline, right? That typically for Saturday assignments, you would have until Monday at 8 o'clock a.m. to turn things in. However, because of the connection issues last week and power outage issues last week, I have adjusted the rough draft of literature review so that it is now due on Tuesday, June 21st at 11:59 p.m. Eastern. And these updated deadlines will be visible on Carmen, although they will still remain outdated on the prompt for the assignment and as well as in the schedule of assignments document, because those were of course posted before we had all of the things that happened last week. So again, the rough draft of literature review, excuse me, is now due on Tuesday, June 21st at 11:59 p.m. Eastern. Now, please keep in mind that this is the, in essence, kind of built-in extended deadline because we don't have time beyond this for you to turn this in, for you to still get feedback that you'll need from me to advance from the rough draft to the final draft, okay? And the reason I chose to delay the rough draft of literature review is because it was not feasible for anyone to turn it in Saturday of last week, but also I felt that using the additional kind of time would create more opportunities for me to just kind of clarify some things in this week's focus lecture and pair those with the conversation I was already planning to have about the final project, and really just kind of hone in on some argumentation techniques that might be of use to you as you draft this initial literature review rough draft. And so taking until Tuesday, in my mind, will create more of an opportunity for you to really be able to work on this assignment. But as I'll talk about in a few slides, the rough draft of the literature review does not need to be a complete draft of everything that you'll turn in for this assignment. Instead, you can kind of think about the rough draft as being an excerpt or part of what you'll turn in for the final. And so I don't want you to feel a pressure that you have to have an entirely perfect, complete rough draft to turn something in. Instead, I'll show you kind of in a few slides what you want to think about turning in for this rough draft. And kind of beyond that, I want you to also really think about the rough draft as an opportunity for you to show me some work that you would like for me to provide feedback on. And so if there's a particular annotation or section of the literature review that you're most concerned with, I strongly recommend that you pursue including that part of the literature review in your rough draft, because you're going to get feedback from me on that draft before you turn in the final draft, okay? So what will happen is you turn in the rough draft of literature review on Tuesday, then you'll work towards producing the final draft of the literature review. However, what you'll get in the interim is you'll get feedback from me on Wednesday that kind of basically allows me to respond to whatever it is that you really prepped in the course of drafting your rough draft, okay? So what that means is that, like I said, with the research proposal, you got feedback from me that was focused on primary sources and secondary sources. With the literature review, I'm going to be focusing in on, do you have a clear argument? How are you starting to draft, the contours of this argument? And are you confidently moving in such a way that it's clear to me that you understand how to actually analyze the parts of an argument in a secondary source, okay? And this is really kind of based loosely on the response papers and how I initially guided you in the direction of noticing certain core details in the secondary sources assigned in this class. And now you're actually doing kind of a different variation of this by selecting your own secondary sources and performing those analyses of, what it's comprised of based on sources that I did not provide to you, okay? So you'll turn in the rough draft of literature review. You'll receive feedback from me on Wednesday that you can then incorporate into the final draft of the literature review. Now, originally, the final draft of the literature review was due between Wednesday, June 22nd and Friday, June 24th. This was a Wednesday assignment deadline, which meant that, there was the kind of initial deadline of Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. Eastern and kind of the hard deadline of Friday at 3 p.m. However, due to the scheduling changes from last week, the final draft of literature review is now due on Friday, June 24th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern, which means that you need to have your final draft of the literature review turned in by midnight on Friday, and there's no time beyond that for you to turn it in. Reason being, if you take too long with the literature review, it's going to really impede on your opportunity to work on the final project, and I would really rather be sure that, in week 8, your exclusive focus is on peer feedback for your semester survival group members on the final project, and that you're really focused on drafting, a rough draft of your final project that's going to allow you to get some of that feedback. And so finally, you'll notice that also for this week, you have a rough draft of the final project, which is due on Saturday, June 25th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern. And this is a hard deadline, which means there's no extended submission past Saturday. It has to be turned in by this Saturday at 11:59 p.m. Eastern to be considered submitted on time. And I'll talk a little bit more about what you'll want to think about having in that rough draft in a few slides. So talk about assignment snapshots for this week, or an overview of week 7 assignments that you need to have on your radar between now and the end of the week. So you have a literature review rough draft, and I want to talk about what you'll want to submit for that rough draft. If you'll recall, last week we talked about the research pre-work that you need to get done in order to prepare a literature review. And much of my focus lecture and even overview lecture was really concentrated on explaining what this research pre-work consists of, right? And as a reminder, for the literature review, you'll need to locate 4 to 6 secondary sources, and at least 2 of the secondary sources included in your literature review should be scholarly peer-reviewed sources, and the remaining sources can be any of the following types of popular press publications that are listed in the second bullet point list visible on my screen, right? And so kind of what that might look like is perhaps you'll do 2 scholarly peer-reviewed sources and 2 popular press publication sources. Some students like to do all scholarly peer-reviewed sources. In the past, some students have done kind of 3 and 3, but at minimum, you need to give me 4 secondary sources, which means at minimum, I should have 2 entries from you that are scholarly peer-reviewed sources and 2 entries that are popular press publications, okay? And then if you choose to do more than that, that is totally up to you. Now, in terms of thinking about what you'll want to turn in for the rough draft of the literature review, I've broken it down into this outline that I think can be kind of helpful to keep on hand as you're working this week. So there's the recommended rough draft and the minimum rough draft requirements. And I'm going to start with the minimum requirements and work my way up to recommended, and I'll explain why in a moment. So looking at the bottom of my screen, I say minimum rough draft requirements for the literature review. What this means is this is what you should definitely turn into me by the Tuesday deadline for this week. Okay, so by Tuesday at midnight, this is what you definitely need to turn in terms of the rough draft of the literature review. You'll definitely want to turn in half or most of the introductory section. So if you'll recall, oops, did I not put it here? I guess I did not. If you look back at the literature review recipe card that is available in the week 6 module on Carmen, I have that recipe card that breaks it down into introductory section, concluding section, and then DISCA. I really would like to see half or most of the introductory section for your literature review visible in your rough draft of the literature review. So this is going to consist of a research topic overview, the transition to argumentative intervention, the revision of thesis statement, and the context/explanation. And this is, of course, clarified further in the recipe card for the literature review. But what I have in bold is a revision of thesis statement. And this is because your semester survival group members will likely have commented on your research proposal rough draft if they were able to identify a thesis statement. Now, if they were not able to find a thesis statement, when I say revision of thesis statement here, what I mean is you'll definitely need to have a thesis statement in your rough draft of the literature review. If you had group members who did identify a thesis statement and either that was inconsistent with what you thought maybe was your thesis statement, or even if they recommended that you should be more specific in certain ways, this is going to then look more like a revision, right? You're going to need to take the kind of initial thesis statement that you presented in the research proposal, and you'll really want to build out the argumentative intervention in the course of this literature review rough draft. But really, if we think about things like the research topic overview, this was likely already included in your research proposal rough draft. And so when we're talking about this introductory section, ideally, you already do have the beginnings of half of it, right? This research topic overview and the thesis statement of some kind. But I've generally found that it's going to be most beneficial for you to at least have the research topic overview, the transition to argumentative intervention, and the revision of thesis statement complete when you turn in your literature review rough draft. If possible, and if you can do the entire introductory section, that is great. But you'll definitely want to give me at least half or most of the introductory section in your literature review as these minimum rough draft requirements. Paired with that, I also would like to see a draft of 1 to 2 full annotations in your literature review rough draft. Now, once again, annotations are going to consist of DISCA, or describe, summarize, connect, and anticipate, for every single secondary source that you include in your literature review. And so you'll definitely want to go back and review the focus lecture from week 6 to make sure that you have a clear sense of how these each will go, along with the literature review recipe card that really runs through these things in more substantial detail. But I would like to see 1 to 2 full annotations from you. Reason being, this will give me the opportunity to give you feedback on your annotations before you turn in the final draft at the end of the week, so that I can flag for you if there's any steps that you're maybe not clear enough on yet, if there's anything that's confusing, and if there are any recommendations that I have in terms of making certain things more clear, whether that's a thesis statement, I'm sorry, not thesis statement, a topic sentence or a transition sentence, whatever it might be, okay? So the minimum rough draft that I would like to see from you by Tuesday at midnight should be half or most of the introductory section to the literature review, and a draft of 1 to 2 full annotations that follow the DISCA method, right? So basically a draft of 1 to 2 annotations of 1 to 2 secondary sources that you've located. Now, if you are able to, I recommend turning in the recommended rough draft for the literature review by Tuesday at midnight. Now, the difference between these is pretty slight. And if you can do more than what's listed here by the time you turn in your rough draft, that's totally fine. It just means that I'll have more material to respond to on Wednesday. So if it's preferable for you to have more feedback from me versus like a few kind of highlights that touch on some patterns that I'm picking up on, you are definitely welcome to give me a full draft of the literature review, or even just more than what's listed in the recommended section, okay? So what I would love to see from you by Tuesday, if you have capacity, would be a draft of the full introductory section, which would mean that instead of giving me half or most of the 4 parts of the intro section, you would give me the research topic overview, the transition to argumentative intervention, the revision of thesis statement, and the context/explanation. I would get a full introductory section. And as a reminder, an introductory section may be 1 or more paragraphs, depending on the needs of your project, okay? So depending on how long your literature review introductory section is, this might be 1 paragraph, this might be 2 paragraphs. You'll kind of see based on what you come up with if you decide to pursue the recommended rough draft version, right? In addition to the full introductory section, I recommend that you also draft 2 full annotations. So instead of it being 1, maybe 2, for the recommended rough draft, you would submit 2 full annotations. And ideally, you would consider submitting 1 popular press secondary source annotation and 1 scholarly peer-reviewed secondary source annotation. And for each of those annotations, you would do the describe, summarize, connect, and anticipate, or DISCA method with each entry, okay? So once again, you need to turn in a rough draft by Tuesday at midnight. The minimum requirements for what that rough draft should feature is that there should be half or most of the introductory section and a draft of 1 to 2 full annotations. But the recommended rough draft, if you're able to do more, would be a draft of the full introductory section and a draft of 2 full annotations, 1 being a popular press source and 1 being a scholarly source, okay? Again, you are welcome to turn in a more substantial rough draft if you have the capacity by Tuesday. I'm happy to respond to a full draft of the literature review if that would make you feel most comfortable going into this week. However, I need to at least have this version of the rough draft for me to consider it having been turned in on time. All right, and just as a reminder, of course, and I talk about this, of course, at length in the focus lecture for week 6, when you're writing the body section or when you're producing these annotations for each of the secondary sources, you'll want to follow DISCA, which again stands for describe, summarize, connect, and anticipate. And I've chosen to include this information here again, just in case it is useful for you to have it kind of visible for you on screen as you're working through this week's materials. those, okay? And at any point as you're working on these DISCA method annotations, if you are struggling with understanding one of the steps, or one common issue sometimes students have is differentiating between connect and anticipate. If you're struggling at all, please let me know, and I would be more than happy to talk through kind of the differences between these and even just strategies for how to construct your body section during office hours or via email. Now, in addition to the rough draft of the literature review, you will need to turn in the final draft of the literature review this week. And again, that will be due on Friday at midnight. Now, the major difference between the rough draft and the final draft of the literature review will be the concluding section. If you notice in my recommendations for the rough draft, I specify that you need to have part of the introductory section and 1 to 2 full annotations depending on which version of the rough draft that you are submitting, right? Now, when it comes to the final draft, of course, you will need to have a complete introductory section. You'll need to have 4 to 6 DISCA method annotations, and then you'll need a concluding section. And so it'll be really important that you make sure that you don't forget this concluding section when you turn in the final draft at the end of this week. And a concluding section is going to feature a sentence or a 2 to 3 sentence review of the overall insight gained, a 2 to 3 sentence recap of credibility and relevance of selected secondary sources, and a 3 to 5 sentence discussion of where specifically you anticipate integrating your secondary sources into the final project. And so as a reminder, a literature review in this capacity really is kind of like the next step of the research proposal in the sense that you can still use tentative language, you can still clarify that you're determining what you may or may not use, but the idea is that this concluding section is really tying all of these parts together. And as a reminder, of course, the literature review should be a 5 to 6 page double-spaced essay in which you synthesize the argument/content of each of the secondary sources that you locate during the research pre-work, and you anticipate how these sources will contribute to your respective argument in the final project. And so this is where the feedback that you received from me and your peers on the research proposal will come in handy, in that you'll really want to think about and kind of respond to this feedback ideally in the introductory section or in the anticipate section of your DISCA method annotations. This is where you can really bring in that feedback to discuss how will having these secondary sources really allow for a more robust, nuanced argument and kind of, well-supported analysis of the primary sources that you are choosing to analyze in some capacity. And again, the formatting requirements for this assignment is 5 to 6 pages double spaced, with 5 full pages being the minimum length and 6 full pages being the maximum length. And if you decide to submit a 5-page essay rather than a 5.5 or 6-page essay, the essay should fill the entire 5th page. You should be following MLA format with a proper header, spacing, and page numbers. There should be a works cited page and properly formatted in-text citations. If you would like me to check those citations, I'm more than happy to do so. But remember, you will need a works cited page by the time you turn in the final version of your literature review. You should also offer a title that is unique to your project and that synthesizes the proposed research topic and argument for your final project. And really just kind of think about how is it that the title that you go with and that you can kind of test out with this literature review. If you didn't provide one with the research proposal, how can you really think about, the way in which this title really kind of synthesizes and captures what's most foundational and crucial to your project. Now, in terms of the final project, you will need to submit a rough draft this week by Saturday at midnight, as I already specified. And you might be thinking, okay, the literature review is going to take me forever, and it is a very demanding assignment. But, excuse me, in terms of this final project, there's a few reasons why it's going to be important for you to turn in a rough draft, right? So as a reminder, the final project prompt is available on Carmen, and it specifies that you have the option of either turning in an essay or alternate format, right? So either doing a traditional research essay or pursuing a creative option for this project. Now, I do want to note that every final project should feature a works cited page in MLA format, as well as proper in-text citations. And so it'll be important for you to determine, based on the form or medium that you're working with for this final project, how can you make sure that that works cited page is incorporated or provided to me, whether that's as a separate file, whether that's included in the kind of the overall file, however you need to do it, right? But what's going to be most important to keep in mind with this final project is that it has a fixed deadline of Saturday, July 2nd at 11:59 p.m. Eastern. And I will not, under any circumstance, accept a final project later than that date, because I've given you as much time as I can before the university grade submission. And so I need your final project by that date and time to make sure that I meet that deadline. Okay. And so we're really working towards, between week 7 and 8, how to make sure that you are in the best possible position to turn in the best possible final draft of the final project. And so with the final project, what you're really doing is producing a refined, in-depth project that incorporates the feedback provided by me and your peers during the earlier steps of the rough draft of research proposal and the rough draft of final project, because you will be getting that peer feedback next week, which I will talk about in next week's materials. But really what this final project needs to have, and that you want to keep in mind as you're working out the lit review and the rough draft, is a thesis-driven, sophisticated argument related to social media discourse. And it should offer a minimum of 5 secondary connections to relevant research and feature substantial close readings of the primary source or sources. And I'll talk about this more in my focus lecture, right? But basically the idea is that you need to close read primary sources, or one or multiple, depending on what you do. And you'll need to have secondary sources incorporated into your final project in some way, 5 different secondary connections, okay? And so your final project, whether it's in comic form, essay form, podcast form, whatever it might be, PowerPoint or Google Slides form, right? You need to have a robust introductory section, a close reading / body section, and a concluding section in your project, all of which should make clear what your purpose, intervention, and methodology as a scholar creator contributing to the conversation is, right? And your project should be well organized and provide clear signposting as to how the literature review contextualizes the argument and how the close readings satisfy the scope of the argument established by the thesis statement. And again, this is really going to be the basis of my sort of focus lecture for this week. And again, thinking about structure, this kind of recaps, which I'll talk more about in the focus lecture, what medium or form is going to be conducive to conveying your argument and to performing those close readings. But for our purposes, I want to remind you once again that you can either turn in a research essay of 8 to 10 pages double spaced, or you can pursue a creative option. This creative option could be a number of things. It could be a zine, a comic, political cartoons, a video or film created with Adobe Spark or other software, a Zoom recording in which you talk through and present the project, a YouTube video essay, a web blog or digital journal of 8 to 10 pages or posts, a social media profile such as Instagram or TikTok with 8 to 10 posts available to read, view, or click through, a PowerPoint or Google Slides presentation, a podcast episode, a music arrangement, et cetera, et cetera. It's not listed here, but also an Adobe Express presentation tends to be pretty popular as a final project option as well. So with this final draft, or I'm sorry, that should say final project. I will correct that. My apologies. That should say rough draft of final project, not rough draft of final draft. Wow. So once again, I have a minimum and recommended rough draft for your final project. And they are as follows. And I've broken it into content and form. Okay, so by Saturday at midnight, the minimum rough draft that you should turn in is as follows. In terms of content, or what it is that you're kind of writing or creating, you should offer a revised thesis statement based on the feedback that you get from me on your literature review rough draft thesis statement. So you should have another version of the thesis statement by Saturday, or if I say this is good to go, obviously you can keep with it. You'll need to produce 1 primary source close reading, which I'll talk about in more detail in my focus lecture, which means you'll need to analyze at least 1 detail from your primary source and have developed a paragraph or so around this primary source close reading. And you'll need to produce 1 secondary source connection in either the introductory section or the close reading section, which means that by Saturday, you'll need to either incorporate a secondary source quote, paraphrase, or summary into either the context section of your final project or into perhaps the primary source close reading that you perform in the course of the body of your project, right? So thesis statement, 1 primary source close reading, and 1 secondary source connection in either the introductory section or the close reading section. In addition to that, by Saturday, The minimum requirement is also that you'll need to determine what medium or form that you will use for the final project. So if you decide that you're going to write a traditional research essay, you should produce a draft that is 1 to 2 pages in length. And those again are double spaced pages. And this applies to this information right here, okay? So you should be turning in 1 to 2 pages double spaced by Saturday of the thesis statement, the primary source close reading, and the secondary source connection if you decide that you want to go ahead and pursue a traditional research essay for the final. If you'd like to pursue a creative option, you'll need to produce a draft that either features some of these creative elements or produce an outline that details how the project will look when it's complete. And I'll talk about this more in the focus lecture, but basically by that I mean you'll need to either maybe start drafting the first page of like your comic or your zine or your cartoons, or you'll need to maybe produce like a minute or 2-minute excerpt that kind of starts to accomplish the things listed in the context or in the content section here, okay? Or if you're unable to kind of start doing the creative option by Saturday, what you would do instead is draft an outline that specifically marks out what goes where. So if you're planning to do an Adobe Express presentation, right? Your outline might detail, here's where I would place all of the information based on what I'm thinking at this point. Or if you're deciding to do a podcast episode, you could start drafting the script and drafting out what's going to go where. Okay, you almost can kind of think about it as like storyboarding for a film. Now, if you want to produce or kind of turn in the recommended rough draft for the final project, it would look as follows. So if you have more capacity by Saturday, you can turn in the following version of the rough draft. You would once again still need to revise the thesis statement based on the feedback that I provide on the literature review. But what's different here is that you would produce 2 to 3 primary source close readings as opposed to 1 primary source close reading. So you would proceed to perform, close readings of 2 to 3 important details from your primary source that really exemplify or show the concepts or argument from your introductory section in action. You would also produce 1 to 2 secondary source connections in either the introductory section or the close reading section of the project, right? So instead of it being 1 secondary source connection, you would turn in 1 to 2. So it's a little bit longer than the minimum requirement. Now, once again, the form requirement here is going to be that you'll need to determine what medium or form that you will use for the final project. So you should be really clear on, am I making a zine? Am I making a comic? Am I making a podcast? Am I making a Google Slides presentation? If you're making a Google Slides presentation, you could also use the Google Slide, kind of affordances to start drafting what this might look like tentatively, right? But the idea is that if you're writing a traditional research essay for the final project and you're doing the recommended rough draft, you'll need to produce a draft that is 2 to 3 double-spaced pages in length. Right? And if you're pursuing a creative option, you would produce a draft that either features some of the creative elements that you want to start working with for next week, or you would produce an outline that details how the project will look when complete. So this is very much the same as in the minimum requirements, except that it's a longer version of the research essay draft, or you'll want to kind of think about how can you really accomplish the content that's listed here in whatever draft or outline that you proceed to create for the rough draft. Okay, so like I said, I will talk about this in more substantial detail in the course of my focus lecture for this week. But for now, that is everything that I have for you in English 2367. My hope is that this overview lecture was helpful for just getting a sense of what the expectations are for this week, as well as the changes that have happened to recognize the challenges of last week. As always, I have office hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 11 o'clock a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Eastern. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I would be happy to meet with you in office hours. I would be happy to schedule an appointment at an alternate time if those times don't work for you, or I'm happy to talk over email if you find that to be the most accessible way to communicate and reach out to me. But for now, this is me, K-Swizzle, signing off for the overview lecture, hoping that you are well, and I will talk to you again in my next lecture. You are almost at the finish line. Keep going. Bye.